Temple Church in Moscow, which is sponsoring this program, along with Emanu-El Lutheran Church of Moscow and the Lutheran Campus Ministry at the University of Idaho. This is part of a series of teach-in, preach-in events that were proposed by the Moscow Interfaith Association in response to vandalism at Temple Beth Shalom and the Holocaust Memorial in Spokane earlier this year. Members of the Moscow Interfaith Association are seeking to call attention to the rise in harassment, vandalism, and violence directed in the United States, and hoping that this conversation will help all people of faith respond in constructive ways to what's happening in our society today. Our moderator today is Tracy Simmons, an award-winning journalist specializing in religion reporting, digital entrepreneurship, and social journalism. Tracy is the executive director of SpokaneFAVS.com, a digital startup that covers religion, news, and commentary based in Spokane, but including participants from throughout the region, several of whom are part of the conversation today. She is a journalism instructor at Washington State University and writes for the Spokesman Review and for Religion News Service. Tracy will help us frame our conversation today and introduce the panelists. Tracy.
Thank you so much, Kenton. It's nice to see everybody. I see some familiar names on the screen today. Before I introduce our panelists, just a couple of ground rules. Looks like you guys are all Zoom experts by now and have yourselves muted. So please stay muted if you're not speaking to keep the echoes away. I'm going to ask our panelists for some remarks, and then we'll have time at the end for a brief Q&A. And I'm going to ask you guys to put your questions when the time comes into the chat. So let me start by introducing Rabbi Tamar Malino, who I've known for several years now. Rabbi Tamar is the rabbi of Temple Beth Shalom in Spokane, where she also serves as rabbi of Congregation Emanu-El. She is Spokane's first female congregational rabbi. She was ordained in 2001 and has served as a congregational rabbi at temples in New York City and also in the San Diego area, where she was also a popular community lecturer and director of the award-winning Hebrew for High School Credit program. She has created programs exploring Jewish spirituality, prayer, Jewish culture, history, and Israel. Her central passion is her role as a teacher in deepening spirituality and strengthening compassion in her community. Our other panelist who I've recently met is Dr. Queller, who is a professional linguist, recently retired from the University of Idaho, where he taught courses in linguistics and languages, including German, Italian, Spanish, and Chinese, as well as Bible as literature. Besides linguistic research, he has published on the Gospel of Mark, and that work critiques the widely held notion that Mark's controversy dialogues were intended as anti-Jewish Christian propaganda, arguing instead that some, at least, portrayed Jesus as participating in an intra-Jewish debate about what constitutes faithful Torah observance. He is a longtime member of Emanu-El Lutheran Church in Moscow, where he currently serves on the church council. So thank you both for leading this discussion for us today. Rabbi Tamar, I wonder if you could begin this conversation by explaining for us the long shadow of anti-Semitism and how our Jewish sisters and brothers continue to experience it.
So first, I want to say thank you very much for having me as part of this discussion. I am incredibly appreciative that you invited me, and also just very appreciative that this conversation is taking place. I think it's important as somebody who has experienced anti-Semitism as an individual and certainly as a community leader, it's just so important and heartening to see that these conversations are taking place in all different kinds of contexts, and especially within the Christian community. So, and also to see that it's taking place in Moscow is wonderful too, although I see some familiar faces on the screen from other places in Idaho and Spokane. So our Northwest is definitely, our inland Northwest community is definitely interconnected, which is wonderful. I wanted to start just briefly, as you said, in response to the vandalism of Temple Beth Shalom. I wanted to start and just share my screen briefly with a photo in case some of you have not seen it. And I thought I had it up. Hold on just a second. It was up just a moment ago. There it is. Okay. So let me just, in case some of you did not get a chance to see the photos, this is one of them. There are many, but this is our temple building. This is our education entrance that we have kids coming in and out of all the time when we're not in COVID world, when we're meeting in session regularly. And you can see the other side of the building over here is where our sanctuary entrance is. But obviously you can see the red swastikas painted on the building. This is a Holocaust memorial that was also defaced, and there was also white power symbols painted in red paint on the glass doors that are a little hard to see from this photo. I didn't want to take too much of the time today to show you the photos, to show you more elaborate, detailed photos, but at least you all get a little bit of a picture of what that looked like and what the experience was of our community in seeing that and responding to it. Unfortunately, it was not the first time we had a swastika painted on the temple building since I've been the rabbi in Spokane. So that's in the last 10 years when I first started at Temple Beth Shalom, which was about 6 years ago. We also had a swastika painted on the building. In that instance, it was a high school student who was relatively ignorant and not really, I don't think, fully, or I know fully did not understand the what he actually did. Although obviously it was enough in the water for him to know that it was a negative thing to put on the synagogue building, but I don't think he even understood the details of it in any way. And I had the chance to actually work with him and do some restorative justice work and some repair work, which was really a very wonderful experience to learn with him and study with him and help him come to a broader understanding of anti-Semitism and also of the importance of diversity and tolerance. So that was a very different experience than this most recent one. And this graffiti was angry and hateful. And I think that what's interesting to me among the contemporary incarnations of anti-Semitism, and clearly what was very evident in the riot at the Capitol as well, where there was anti-Semitism on display, broadly on display in that context, as well as the march in Charlottesville, is how, from a few years ago, is how acceptable it has become in modern American society to show anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic sentiments, and how little it's really understood. And I see this too in our high school students. We have high school students that come to Jewish high school students that come together at the synagogue from all over the city of Spokane. And since we've been doing virtually, we have a few kids from Pullman and Moscow area as well. But every single one of them has a story to tell of an anti-Semitic incident that they encountered in high school, and they encounter them relatively regularly, including a sense in which people don't understand the symbolism of a swastika. And so when I started to speak about what had happened at the temple, I made very clear and sure to say that a swastika is a death threat towards Jews. And I don't think most people really understand that. They say, oh, it's, something of the Nazi era, right? But the experience of seeing a swastika is not unlike the experience of having a noose represented in an African-American community. It's the same context and the same idea. And of course, it's horrific and frightening and threatening and all other kinds of things. But our students encounter that relatively regularly in school, and we try to help them articulate what the problem is with that, and I think that's an important way to articulate it if it comes up. But really, I wanted to start by saying that partly when we talk about anti-Semitism, I think what can be both intellectually and emotionally confusing about it is that Jewish identity has a lot of different aspects, right? Jewish identity isn't just one thing. Being Jewish isn't just one thing or another, but really it's an intersection, and in some ways maybe best represented by a Venn diagram of different aspects of identity. So for Jews, people are Jewish by religion, right? Maybe the most familiar and easily identifiable aspect of Jewish identity. But there are plenty of Jews who identify as Jewish, but also are secular and don't necessarily consider themselves religious, but are Jewish by virtue of their ethnicity or their family association and their birth. And then there are people who are Jewish where the primary expression of their Judaism is a peoplehood expression, an affiliation with the full people of Israel. And that is those different designations of how people see themselves included in what it means to be Jewish, I think are important to recognize because each of them are addressed by different kinds of anti-Semitism. And obviously the goal of our conversation today is really to talk about Christian anti-Semitism in particular, but it really is very much a larger picture that addresses different aspects of Jewish identity. So I think that it's just good to keep that in mind because some anti-Semitism is clearly religiously motivated and some anti-Semitism is in response to Jewish identity, understanding Jewish identity, of course, as a race or an ethnicity, which is what we talk about when we talk about Nazi Germany. And I'll just say from a personal perspective, an individual perspective, I've been a target of anti-Semitism in different forms my whole life. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is an interesting environment in and of itself. But largely I had experiences of Christian anti-Semitism. I, quite distinct memories as an elementary school of being told I was going to hell because I was Jewish on a relatively regular basis. I definitely had, families whose kids wouldn't let them, parents whose kids wouldn't let them play with me because I was Jewish. I was asked if I had horns, right, which of course comes from a mistranslation of and a misinterpretation of Moses coming down from the mountain with rays of light coming from his head. So the portrayal of Jews with horns was an unusual understanding of that, and and of course echoes too of Satanism and Jews as the devil come through that imagery as well. So as a child, I experienced it on a relatively regular basis in some form or another, and then continued as an adult in different ways. I think the Northwest is an interesting case study, of course, with the Aryan nations, the presence of the Aryan nations here. And when I first came to Spokane 10 or 11 years ago, it sort of stunned me that we had a police car outside the temple for every event, for every religious school event, for every Wednesday, every Sunday, every Friday night for worship services, every Saturday morning for worship services. And I thought when I first joined this community that was really overkill. Why would we do that? Why would we need that? Seemed kind of obsessive. And also the temple building itself, if you look at it, it's representative of the architecture of when it was built, but it does awfully feel like a bunker with the cement walls there, even though it is beautiful. Parts of it are very beautiful on the inside. And it was part of the mentality, I think, of what it means to be Jewish in the Inland Northwest, which is that you are anxious on a regular basis about what's coming down the road and what the possibilities are. And I think, like I said, I thought it was overkill when I first moved here, and I have increasingly not felt that way and felt very grateful for the security that we are able to have at the temple. Unfortunate though that it is, and certainly in recent years between the shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh and the rally in Charlottesville, and of course the graffiti experience. So I would say the shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh was really a shock, I think, that reverberated across the Jewish world. and certainly for our congregation in particular, our synagogue at Temple Beth Shalom is very similar to the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in the sense that it houses more than one congregation. The worship services, as they were described, are very familiar and very similar to what we have. Who's there? The first thing, I'm sure those of you who are churchgoers can kind of recognize that, who the regulars are, who's there first thing in the morning. All of that really played into kind of very intimate sense of what happened in Pittsburgh could happen anywhere. And I will say that for me, that was particularly traumatic, and kind of envisioning it happening to our congregation on a given Saturday morning. And even my daughter, a couple of days ago, we were talking about what was going on in Israel and Palestine, and we were talking about some of the racism, the issues around racism and Black Lives Matter in the US. And she said, I don't understand why people hate so much. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I wish it were the case that I weren't afraid of going to the synagogue because I would get shot. And I thought, this is what my daughter is saying to me. She's 12, and she's preparing for her bat mitzvah, and in this, when we have services in person there quite regularly. And for that to be the thing that came out of her mouth, just kind of, it was shocking to me too, even though we had had that conversation, of course, when the Tree of Life shooting first happened, but it's a few years and she was right up there ready to have it again. So I think that maybe is probably the most stark illustration of the experience of anti-Semitism up until today, up until this moment. But of course, there is a tremendously long history of anti-Semitism, and we see it, not just in Nazi Germany. We see it starting from the story of what Pharaoh said in the Bible about how to deal with the Jews in Egypt, right? We shouldn't, they're too smart and too numerous for us, and so we need to deal with them. And I think, and that we can go through centuries of succeeding history of different places where Jews lived and Jews were expelled from, and the experience of Jews in Christian countries and the experience of Jews in Muslim countries, which for many centuries was not as nearly as difficult as an experience of being Jewish in a Christian country. But of course, in the late 19th and 20th century became a different story for a variety of different reasons, but still was certainly an experience of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish riots and things like that all over the Middle East. So it is not, I think it would take a lot longer to go through the history, but I think also in a contemporary, I guess I wanted to share one additional quote from Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who passed away just about a year ago, was the chief rabbi of Great Britain for many years. And he wrote a lot of different things about anti-Semitism, but one paragraph that I think is a really clear explanation and understanding of some of the contemporary ways in which anti-Semitism expressed. And he says, anti-Semitism is not a unitary phenomenon, a coherent belief or ideology. Jews have been hated because they were rich and because they were poor, because they were capitalists and because they were communists, because they believed in tradition, because they were rootless cosmopolitans, because they kept to themselves, or because they became integrated everywhere. Anti-Semitism is not a belief, but a virus. The human body has an immensely sophisticated immune system which develops defenses against viruses. This was written before the pandemic. It is penetrated, however, because viruses mutate. Anti-Semitism mutates. And I think that's really a powerful way to describe it, because the truth is that we can look at all different ways in which anti-Semitism manifests, because it changes each time. And really what it is, of course, is an intolerance of diversity and difference and a hatred for people who are different than you. And that's what thankfully, my daughter doesn't understand why there is that in the world, but we still need to continue to confront it and to deal with it and to continue to have these kinds of conversations. So again, I really appreciate you having me, and I look forward to answering questions. I saw a few of them pop up in the chat, but I'll wait till for Tracy to facilitate, and I look forward to hearing from Dr. Queller. So again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yes, I'm seeing questions come in and I'm making notes of them. We probably won't get to all of them, but we're gonna go over to Dr. Queller now, who's gonna talk a little bit about history. Can you talk, Dr. Queller, about the Christian theological roots of anti-Semitism, specifically beginning from the New Testament, perhaps, which Professor Rabbi Malino just alluded to? We can see your slides, but we can't hear you.
Kurt, please unmute yourself again. Still muted.
Unmute, there we go.
There you go.
And slideshow. Okay, are you seeing my slide?
Yes,
And only my slide?
only your slides. Please go
Excellent.
ahead.
So we can start. Let's see. One further thing. No, this will work fine. So I want to talk briefly about my personal stake in the matter, just to frame this. As a descendant of German-speaking Lutherans and of German-speaking Jews, I imagine relatives on the Lutheran side of my family tree sitting around the dinner table in the 1930s in Germany, inconclusively debating whether Hitler had the right solution to the so-called Jewish problem. Well, those on the Jewish side are being persecuted, rounded up, and eventually sent to the death camps. Okay. Now I need to figure out how to advance the slide. There we go. I'm going to have to do it in the navigator. Now, how is this possible? The answers to the question are complex, and it must be said that the same question must be asked also of German Catholics and of Orthodox Christians, as well as Catholics and Protestants throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. The question was hardly ever asked in the polite American Lutheran circles in which I grew up. The polite tacit assumption, I think, was simply that there was something disastrously wrong in the cultural DNA of Germans. Thank heavens we're not like that. But I couldn't shake the question growing up. Later in life, ultimately with the help of the internet, I did some investigating of my own. Some of what I found shocked me. The answer was, of course, much bigger than Luther or Lutheranism. It's a general problem with Christianity, and of course, as Rabbi Tamar said, it's even broader than that. But I did learn something that had never been a secret to Luther scholars. Martin Luther himself had a serious Jewish problem. Martin Luther's Jewish problem occurred in two phases. Darn it, my animation is not working here. This is animated, so you're going to see my slides all at once. In the middle of his life, in 1523, he published a tract called That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, where he, for his time, articulated a surprisingly tolerant and open attitude towards Jews, urging fellow Christians and particularly his fellow Protestants to befriend Jews, allow them to practice professions and live among them and so on, something that had often not been the case. But by 20 years later, in 1543, very near the end of his life, he published a tract entitled The Jews and Their Lies. And in this later Luther advocated vehemently for the burning of synagogues and for the expulsion of all Jews from German territory. For centuries, this hateful rhetoric was largely ignored, but in the 20th century, Nazi propagandists resurrected it and used it to great effect. Let me just check briefly if I'm, yes, okay, rehearse slideshow. Let me reframe, and then I can, I think, use the animation and the other things that I have set up. Again, you see only my slide now, right? Okay, yes. Two phases. So Nazis used this late Luther rhetoric to great effect. On Kristallnacht, November 9th through 10th, 1938, Jewish shop windows were smashed and synagogues were burned all over Germany, more than 1,000 of them. And here's a quote, a rather surprising quote. from that time. Today on Luther's birthday, the synagogues are burning in Germany. The Lutheran people must hear the words of this man, the greatest anti-Semite of his time, the warner of his people against the Jews. That quote is from Martin Sasse, the bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Thuringia and a leader of the pro-Nazi German Christian movement. Now, of course, there was also Christian, as well as Christian collaboration like Sasse, there was also resistance. One of the best known names, of course, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We also have Edith Stein, a Jewish convert to Catholicism, and Sophie Scholl, a young university student who joined the White Rose movement and was executed by the Nazis. And they and many more are commemorated and celebrated in, among other places, in the Yad Vashem memorial in Jerusalem. Now, in the wake of the Holocaust, many Christians have become aware that the very framing of the question at issue is and always was pernicious. There's an urgent need for reframing, and that reframing is underway, but it's still not complete. What throughout most of the history of Christendom was called the Jewish problem needs to be framed as the problem of anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, as Rabbi Tamar mentioned, are not the same thing. Anti-Judaism is a specifically religious phenomenon. It has to do with religious opposition to Judaism, that is the religion of the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism builds on that and is partly, but only partly independent from that in terms of the overlapping kind of Venn diagram that Rabbi Tamar was talking about. So anti-Semitism, at least in its modern form, is a racialized and often secularized outgrowth of anti-Judaism involving hatred and persecution of the Jewish people. However, although there are other inputs to anti-Semitism than classical religious anti-Judaism, it is a very big factor, and as we'll discuss, it is not insignificant even today in the formation of anti-Semitism in our culture. Our focus here will therefore be on religious anti-Judaism. Why? Most participants in this webinar are presumably not raving anti-Semites. However, anti-Semitism does have specifically religious roots, particularly in Christian anti-Judaism. Progress in combating anti-Semitism requires us to address address these roots. Note, we could also talk about ancient pagan anti-Judaism, Muslim anti-Judaism, and even new atheist anti-Judaism. But in focusing specifically on Christian anti-Judaism, I'm not exonerating any other variety. As a Christian myself, I'm simply trying to follow Jesus' wise dictum that we need first to attend to the plank in our own eye before attending to the mote in other people's eyes. So, aspects of Christian anti-Judaism. I want to cover, if we have time, 4 different aspects. First, Christian supersessionism, or what's sometimes called replacement theology. Second, a tendency of Christianity to define itself as a positive antithesis to a negatively caricatured Judaism. 3, arrogantly exclusivist interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, or what the Christians call Old Testament. And 4, some precursors in the New Testament, whether apparent or real. So let's first talk about Christian supersessionism or replacement theology. This is an idea that has always been widespread in Christianity and is still fairly strong, that the Jews originally were God's covenant people. You can see the Torah scrolls there representing the covenant, but the Jews sinned and God took away the covenant from the Jewish people and gave it to the good Christian people, right? So now the true people of Israel in this thinking are Christians, right? Replacing Jews as God's people. Christian supersessionism, well, you get a few traces of it in the New Testament, and we'll talk about that. But here's an important quote from Paul in Romans, who says, "I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable," right? Also, staying with Paul, Paul has a rather surprising, strange, and in some ways beautiful allegory or parable of the olive tree. And in addressing Gentile Christians, which are his audience in that letter and others, he says, "You have been cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, you Gentiles, you non-Jews, and grafted contrary to nature by God into a cultivated olive tree," by which he means God's people, Israel. "Therefore, do not boast. Remember that it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you," right? This is not a replacement theology, right? Fortunately, in scholarly commentary, including commentary meant for the common reader and for pastors preparing sermons, there are some helps for this. There's a brand new series called Reading the New Testament After Supersessionism. Only a few volumes are out, including the Romans one. And I urge especially pastors and Christian educators to keep an eye out for that and similar books, because supersessionism creeps in even unintentionally into much of our preaching and teaching. Now, eventually there was a parting of the ways between Rabbinic Judaism and early Jewish Christianity as it transformed into a Gentile, that is non-Jewish religion of its own. Both have their origins in late Second Temple Judaism. And by Second Temple, we mean that period between the end of the Babylonian exile and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, a couple of generations after Jesus' death. So there was a parting of the ways. There was a long period in which Christians were primarily Jewish Christians and were within the broader fold of Judaism as one sect. But eventually you did have a parting where Rabbinic Judaism went one way, Gentile Christianity went another way. That was a very long process. It's very difficult to date, but it did happen. So second point that we wanted to talk about, the tendency of Christians to define ourselves as the positive antithesis to a negatively caricatured Judaism. And you might call this appropriative supersessionism. So throughout the Bible, both what Christians call both the Old and the New Testament, there are polarities between law and grace, wrath and forgiveness, slavery versus freedom, the flesh versus the spirit, and others. After the parting of the ways, Gentile Christians sought to rhetorically appropriate the positive sides of these polarities for themselves, while leaving the negative sides to define the Jews, now regarded as a distinct religion, right? So they appropriate the good stuff and leave the bad stuff to define the Jews. And let me introduce you then to a prominent advocate of this position, a second century Christian, though not one of the church fathers. He was shunned by them ultimately, Marcion of Sinope. He compiled the first canon of the New Testament early mid second century. It included the Gospel of Marcion, which was an abbreviated, edited version of the Gospel of Luke, and 10 Pauline epistles. He rejected the entire Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, and he rejected the Jewish God of the Old Testament as vengeful and capricious. He saw the Old Testament God as the malevolent demiurge, the creator God of Gnosticism. So in saying he rejected the Jewish God, he didn't reject the existence of that God. He regarded that God as a lesser God. And the God he affirmed was a true supreme God of love and mercy, who was revealed for the first time only in Jesus Christ, according to Marcion. Marcion saw Jesus as pure spirit, only appearing to us as a human, offering spiritual salvation from an evil material world. This is the Gnostic doctrine of Docetism or Docetism, depending on how you pronounce it. Marcion was excommunicated by Orthodox Christianity, and his teachings were designated as a heresy. Nevertheless, Marcion's legacy lives on. So what is that legacy? Well, just consider whether you're Jewish, Christian, or neither of the above, consider how many times you've heard this from people. And again, this could be people of all sorts of persuasions and flavors. I feel attracted to the loving God that Jesus reveals in the New Testament, but I'm really put off by that vengeful Old Testament God. I'll wager probably all of you have heard that at one time or another, probably repeatedly. question is, how do we respond to that? And I'm going to put that to you because I'm still working on a good response myself. I can give a nice lecture on that, but in the actual moment when you're confronted with this, how do you find a way that is non-judgmental but firm and kind of points people in the right direction? Any suggestions would be welcome. So undoing Marcion's legacy, one thing that Christians have to realize is that we find all these polarities in both the testaments, right? Christians need to find positive ways of defining our faith, ways that acknowledge its indebtedness to biblical Judaism, but that do not depend upon biased negative caricatures of Judaism, and that are not based on false dichotomies, right? But what about Paul, you might well ask at this point, because all these polarities, for anybody who's read Paul or just casually heard him read or preached in church, knows that all of these polarities are very characteristic of Paul's thought and his writing. So aren't his letters full of these dichotomies? The answer is absolutely yes. And a second question, doesn't he appropriate the positive terms for Christianity, leaving the negative terms to define Judaism? The answer to that is really well no. And one major reason for that is that in Paul's time, Christianity didn't yet exist. Paul was a Messianic Jew operating within Judaism, but regarding himself as the apostle to the Gentiles, to non-Jews. Here I want to introduce you, if you don't know him, to Krister Stendahl, who was the Bishop of Stockholm and Dean of the Harvard Divinity School for many years as well. A great Lutheran scholar who kind of kicked off the new perspective on Paul. And a more famous face, some of you might recognize this face, N.T. Wright, former Bishop of Durham in the Anglican Church in England and a well-known New Testament scholar. They kicked off a revision of traditional notions of Paul, and particularly Krister Stendahl. I want to mention his seminal essay, Paul Among Jews and Gentiles. This is from the 1960s. And he urged that we stop talking about Paul's conversion, not because it's politically incorrect or whatever, but because Paul did not consider himself to have converted from Judaism. He was still in Judaism, and he perceived a call from the resurrected Christ, which he at least believed he had seen a vision of, to bring the Gentiles into the fold of the people of God. So he did not convert to a new religion. There's even a newer perspective than the new perspective on Paul, called Paul Within Judaism. And there are a few names especially associated with that. There was a fairly broad group. Mark Nanos, who among other things wrote Reading Romans Within Judaism. And one of my favorites, Paula Fredrickson, whose book, Paul, the Pagan's Apostle, I just finished. A real eye-opener to me. So what do the Paul Within Judaism people claim? Well, Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, addresses his letters to fill in the blank. It's probably obvious. He addresses them to Gentiles, to Gentile Christians. Well, again, that's an anachronism, to Gentile Christ believers in his communities. He's not talking to Jews primarily. I don't say he didn't talk to Jews. I'm saying his letters are addressed to Gentiles. His letters contain both positive and negative comments on Torah, his negative comments on the law, and his positive comments on the law or Torah. His negative comments are directed against Judaizers who want Gentiles to undergo circumcision and to appropriate all the other features of, of Jewish practice. Paul was against that, but he had many positive remarks on Torah, and those regard Torah observance within Judaism. So he was against Gentiles fully appropriating Judaism. He was not against Torah observance for Jews. And there, I don't have time to cite chapter and verse here, but this is a pretty solid finding. So why did Paul propose for a full conversion of Gentiles to Judaism? Paul had an eschatological, that is, end time scenario, a very vivid and burning one. Israel's final salvation would be preceded by an ingathering of Gentile nations to worship Israel's God. And there's much basis for this in the prophets and elsewhere, especially Isaiah, but not only. And Paul's understanding was that the fulfillment of end time prophecy required that these grafted in Gentiles, we remember we talked about the allegory of the olive tree where Gentiles were being grafted in to the tree, to the cultivated olive tree of Israel. His vision of this required that Gentiles remain Gentiles while being grafted in. Furthermore, Paul believed that Christ's life, death, and resurrection was the means by which the Gentiles were being brought in, apart from the works of the law, right? And that full conversion of Gentiles into Jews would render Christ's sacrifice meaningless, and that it would undermine God's plan for the salvation of Jews and Gentiles because, and let me just go back here for a second, his vision of the fulfillment of these end time prophecies in Isaiah and elsewhere required that Gentiles worship Israel's God together with Jews as Gentiles, right? So he was against conversion of Gentiles fully into Judaism, but not against Judaism per se at all. Okay, third point.
Dr. Queller, I just wanted to let you know it's 12:45. And I know we want to let Rabbi Tamar talk one more time before we go to questions.
Right, okay. We started a little bit late on this, but I'll try to rush through this. Arrogantly exclusivist interpretation of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. This is probably in many ways at the root of Luther's Jewish problem. Luther saw the entire Old Testament as foreshadowing Christ. He saw this as the only reasonable reading of Hebrew scriptures. And he assumed that if he patiently exposited his reading of their own scriptures to Jewish people, they would convert to Reformed Christianity in large numbers, and therefore help him poke a finger in the eye of the Catholic Church, incidentally. When this failed to happen, his attitude towards Jews became spiteful and hateful. A corrective for modern readers, there are many, but I want to recommend this book by Amy Jill Levine and Marx V. Brettler, two Jewish commentators on the Bible. And I'm going to skip forward a little bit here for lack of time, and just mention another book of theirs, the Jewish Annotated New Testament. This is a commentary on the New Testament with a verse-by-verse commentary and essays added from a Jewish perspective, but actually very friendly to Christianity. These are not Jews for Jesus. They are Jews for Judaism, but they have very eye-opening and interesting and persuasive perspectives that are useful for Christians. Finally, precursors in the New Testament, apparent or real. I want to get to one main thing here before wrapping up. First, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's largely sectarian rhetoric within late Temple, Second Temple Judaism. It originates in intra-Jewish debate, and it's usually directed at specific contemporary groups within Judaism, scribes, Pharisees, chief priests. A special case, though, that really deserves mentioning, and I'm going to rush through this. Those of you who are watching this later on YouTube can look at these slides in more detail. There's Matthew's portrayal of the crowd at Jesus' trial before Pilate, saying, "His blood be on us and our children." The slander of Jewish blood guilt. There's a better explanation than the usual one here, and namely that Matthew adds this detail to Mark's earlier account as a foreshadowing of the Romans' destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Common Era, already in Matthew's past, but still in Jesus' future. The children of Jerusalemites, who in 30 CE had been part of the festival crowds in Jerusalem, later experienced this disaster when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Matthew interpreted this blood, the blood that was shed in this catastrophe, as resulting from Jerusalemite crowds having chosen to have Pilate free the zealot Barabbas instead of Jesus. It was the zealots' failed insurrection against Rome, which 40 years later had led to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. So that us and our children thus refers to zealot sympathizers who would be alive in 70 CE, and many of whom would in fact be killed in the Roman repression. Matthew's narrative does not impute blood guilt for Jesus' crucifixion to all successive generations of Jewish people. And modern Christian liturgy, in fact, and hymnody largely interpret the guilt of the crowd as our own guilt. Think of the those of you who are Christian, think of the famous Lenten the Good Friday hymn, I crucified thee. And Matthew's polemic is still essentially against factions within late Second Temple Judaism. Okay, it's not supersessionist, and there's this quote from the Sermon on the Mount that is fairly obvious in that respect. And this is not surprising because the author of the Gospel of Matthew was a Messianic Jew, as probably were most of his addressees. The Jews' adversaries in the Gospel of John, just to run through this, Raymond E. Brown, probably the best known Christian commentator on the Gospel of John, a Catholic priest, sees the red hot anti-Jewish rhetoric in the Gospel of John as a response to the community's exclusion from the synagogue. This is a reconstruction, and not all people agree with it. Adele Reinhardt's thinks that such exclusions from diaspora synagogues were rare and has other explanations. Regardless, the main point is that scholars generally agree that the invective against the Jews placed on Jesus' lips in the Gospel of John is an anachronism. Jesus was a Jew. And the rhetoric is unfortunately anti-Jewish, but it reflects the bitterness of that community at a certain stage in their development. It's not the attitude of Jesus. Repenting of anti-Christian, anti-Judaism, I'm going to skip through some of these things and leave them for people to look at in the YouTube version of this. Beyond the things that the church officially has to do, we need to participate in interfaith dialogue. I have a few slides on that you can look at your leisure at in more detail. Part of Luther's anti-Jewish problem, he didn't really know any Jews. Here you have Thomas Kaufmann, the author of an important, well, let me go back, an important book, this Luther's Jews, A Journey into Anti-Semitism. Kaufmann is probably the best known German Luther scholar currently, and a Lutheran himself. He notes that Luther's Jews are a conglomeration of ill-defined fears, ... I'm not going to read that all. In other words, sheer fantasy, a phantom. I'm going to end with this quote, and again, I won't read it in detail. This is from a pair of Lutheran pastors, theologians, and teachers at a Lutheran seminary, right? Martin Luther never danced at a Jewish wedding, etc. Question, will our dancing at Jewish weddings and inviting Jewish people to dance at ours prevent future acts of vandalism at Temple Beth Shalom and elsewhere? The answer is probably not. Anti-Semitism has a long history. It's embedded in our culture. But I'd like to close with imagining this. What if in 1920s, 1930s Germany and elsewhere in Europe, the conversations around the dinner tables had involved Gentile Christians and their Jewish friends, whether observant, religiously observant or not. When the Nazi suppression started, and it started slowly, this is crucial. The Holocaust, the Shoah, did not begin with the ovens, with the crematoria. It began very slowly and by degrees, testing the water at each step to see whether people would, enough people would go along with that. What if enough German Lutherans and Catholics had actually known Jews and had been inclined and motivated to resist those early steps when, say, Jews were disappearing from their places of work or from their children's schools, and finally when Jews were being disappeared from their neighborhoods. If German Christians and Christians elsewhere in Europe had stood up and resisted at those early phases, could the Holocaust have been avoided? Well, we'll never know, but whoops. It just might have. And so that question is relevant historically, but it's also relevant today because these problems are still with us, as Rabbi Tamar pointed out. So I'm going to end right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Queller. Lots of really good information there. I know I'll probably have to rewatch some of that and really helpful resources. So Rabbi Tamar, I wonder, what do you think might be the most crucial issues to confront going forward?
That's kind of
I know it's a big
question.
Big question. Yeah.
That's a
And then
big
from
question.
here, we'll try to go to some of the questions in the chat. But
Sure. First of all, again, I guess I want to thank Dr. Queller for inviting me to sit around the table. So that's the first thing. I appreciate that vision of things. And I do, in a certain sense, think that, that interpersonal relationships are partly the answer to all questions of intolerance and racism and bigotry, and all the ways in which it manifests, is that we are obligated to examine our implicit bias, examine systemic issues, and to do our own internal work to overcome them, and then to build personal relationships with people who are different than we are. I really think that if there's any hope to be had, it's in that direction. I think that so I guess that's really what I would say. I think we in the Northwest are particularly plagued with more of the white nationalist, white supremacist presence than other areas of the country. I think we have to be super aware of that, and also the way in which it has infiltrated the mainstream politics in the United States. So I would say that that's also on our agenda, because the Nazis, the difference, and this came up in a couple of instances, both after the Charlottesville rally and then also in other contexts of conversations that I had with members of my community. And they said to me, partly in response to the 2016 election and all of that, when is it time to leave? Like, when do we have to leave the United States? Like, we should have left Germany, basically. And part of my answer was, the anti-Semites don't have power in the same way in the United States than they did in Germany, right? And we didn't elect them, and they don't have power, and so we have to be conscious of that. So I think we have that we're obligated to be conscious of the places where anti-Semitism gains a foothold in systems of power, in particular in our country, and in some of the discourse around that. So that's, I guess that's what I'll say in terms of what the most pressing issues are, is to keep a finger on the pulse of when that begins to happen, and to respond to it directly.
thank you. So we have several questions came in. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them. If people need to jump off at one, definitely understand. A term you referred to, Rabbi, and also that was in Dr. Queller's slides. Alan asked, when you speak of people of Israel, what do you mean? And either of you can answer that one.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to go first, Dr. Queller, or do you want to go first? That could take up the webinar, the whole session in and of itself. But
you did already mention, Rabbi Tamar, the intersecting Venn diagrams, right? Religious Jews, other kinds of identification.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess what I would say, when I talk about Jewish peoplehood, and that's that was the term that I think I'm talking about contemporary identity. We could spend a lot of time talking about Hebrew Bible and New Testament understandings of, who the people of Israel are, as that interpretation developed through the centuries. But I would say, in terms of contemporary Jewish identity, kind of what I was referring to is this, is a distinction, right? When we talk about ethnic Jewish identity, we talk about religious Jewish identity, that's sort of rather obvious and easier to define. We talk about ethnic Jewish identity, I think that's also easy to define in one sense and hard in another. And maybe that's where the definition of peoplehood comes in, because, Jews don't all look like me, right? There are many different ethnicities, really, right? Jews from all different places in the world, Jews from Arab countries that much more look like their neighbors. They're really people of color in the way that we might define that in the United States. They don't look white. There are Jews from Ethiopia who are Black. There are plenty of Jews who are descended from people who've converted in earlier generations who are Black and Asian. And we're having kind of big internal conversation in the Jewish community about Jews of color and our relationship and the ways in which they face issues in the Jewish community. So I think when we talk about ethnicity, Jewish ethnicity, it's kind of complicated to identify that. And sometimes the way that it gets included in a larger category is to talk about Jewish peoplehood, which of course then has a nationalist identity as well for Israelis in the state of Israel. And that's a whole other big topic that will take us off that. And, you know, and I know there were a couple of questions in the chat about current events, and I would really be happy to respond to those, but I do think that they're off topic. So, you know, I'll leave it to you, Tracy, whether or not you want to go there. But I think, so that's one way when we talk about Jewish peoplehood, it's kind of an overarching category to talk about Jews from all over the world and Jews with different ethnicities who identify as part of the Jewish people today. And there are gray areas in that, but that would be the overarching category that I was really using when I was talking about different aspects of Jewish identity. That's a quick answer, maybe.
Okay. Kurt, did you want to add anything or?
No, that's great.
Okay, great. We did have a couple of questions, like you said, about the current events, and I think Andy frames it fairly well. He says some people who are opposed to U.S. foreign policy as it pertains to the nation of Israel are being told they are anti-Semitic. How can we best explain the difference to those who don't see it? And it kind of piggybacks off another question that Paul asked, which is it being anti-Semitic to be critical of Israel's government? A big question, another big question.
Right. No, I mean, this is for me and not for Dr. Queller.
Sure.
I think I will say in some senses, it's all about context. And in other ways, I think, so there is a very extensive conversation about when does criticism of Israel veer into anti-Semitism. I don't think there's no black and white answer to that. I think that there are many Jews who would say, if you don't agree with the idea that Jews should have self-determination in their own land, that is an anti-Semitic statement, right? If you don't agree that the state of Israel should exist as a Jewish state, that's problematic. And I think there are different voices in the Jewish community who will respond to that question differently. But I do think that when we talk about, you know, especially when we're talking in the context of a conversation about broader anti-Semitism in the world, that's really an important way to frame that question about whether or not Jews have, you know, if that there are plenty of people who would say that it's anti-Semitic to say that there can't be a Jewish state. So that's one way of responding to that question about whether Israel should exist as a state at all. There's a separate conversation about criticism of the Israeli government and of political choices of the Israeli government. I would not say a priori that that's anti-Semitic at all. There are plenty of Jews who would say that. There's plenty of, you know, larger questions about political mechanisms in Israel and military responses and all of that. I do think that some of the rhetoric that happens around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is definitely anti-Semitic. I will say that. And so I think it's very much a question of context and very much a question of how it's articulated and what's said. I've seen lots and lots of things over social media that I would label anti-Semitic around the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's very tough. And I will, you know, kind of again echo that. That's been really tough on my teenage kids who, you know, have all kinds of friends with all kinds of opinions and, you know, live in the social media world far more than I do. And they're struggling to respond to the things that people say with any, you know, with any sort of ability to say, you know, this is what I believe, but that doesn't mean that I want to be racist. And, you know, it's very ugly, as is many other conversations on social media. So I don't want to just limit it to that, but I think there are ways of criticizing Israel for sure that don't veer into anti-Semitism, but I think it's very easy to get there. And it's hard. It's just a hard conversation to have from a lot of angles. But anyway, I'll stop there. I know that there could again be lots more detail and lots more conversation, but it really, because I guess I'll say one other piece, which is there's this, you know, Jews are okay. There's a sort of underlying Jews are only okay if they're the victims, right, and not with power. There's a conversation, you know, that sort of the statement that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs sort of had. It's like there's, you know, there's a sort of discussed that Jews were led to the slaughter, right? That way in which people appropriate Jews. And then there's this sort of like, well, but you also can't have your own power. Like there's a weird dialectic that comes in the way that people talk about the state of Israel. And you know, so I would say maybe that articulates a little bit of the question in a little bit of the way that the conversation sometimes is framed. So again, I'll leave it there. There's so much more to say and so many more layers to peel back to really dive into that question. But
definitely, thank you for talking about that. This is a question that's more of a comment. If one of you want to comment back, perhaps. Stephen says, in the Gospel of John, it is often the Jews who oppose something about Jesus, but can people start pointing out that it was, according to the story, only a group of Jews, i.e. priests, some people in the street, etc.?
Yeah, I can talk to that, and I'm not a John scholar. I am a little bit of a Mark scholar. I'd say yes and no. Yes, in answer to Stephen, because the Johannine community was a Messianic Jewish community at the outset, at least, consisting primarily of Jews. Very preoccupied with Jewish festivals. The final version of the Gospel of John we have, and most scholars think it went through a very long evolution through various stages. The final version with respect to this love for Jewish festivals is supersessionist. Our community and only our community understand the real meaning of the festivals, and that has to do with Jesus Christ. And if you're not on board with that, you don't understand the festivals and so on. Possibly sectarian, like the Synoptic Gospels. I mentioned that with respect to the Synoptic Gospels, that what apparently anti-Jewish rhetoric is mostly intra-Jewish sectarian rhetoric. The fact that the final version of the Gospel of John as we have it talks about the Jews as adversaries seems to suggest to me, although I'm no expert on this, that the parting of the ways had in some sense really happened there already, and that these people were no longer regarding themselves as Jews. They had, but they no longer did. And what to make of that is difficult. I'm eagerly awaiting you remember I showed a slide of that reading Romans after supersessionism. I'm eagerly awaiting the volume on John. I think that's going to be really revealing and really helpful. And I wish I could anticipate more of what's going to be in there, but I can't yet.
Thank you. Let me wrap it up with this. I think this is a great first step to bring people together. Do either of you have other ways, other ideas on how we can bridge Jewish-Christian relations?
Well, I had one, I guess, maybe additional thing to say
Sure, yeah.
to Dr. Queller's question about how we talk about the Hebrew Bible and how we talk about the and the question about, you know, the Old Testament God being vengeful and the, you know, and then the New Testament portrayal of the importance of love. And I've actually seen that question come up also around legalism and some of the certain stereotypes. I've seen that come up in contemporary churches when I've attended a church service, and you know, they didn't know I was in the congregation. You know, I was a guest of a friend, and you know, they're like, and people, you know, people just say things like, well, you know, the Jews didn't understand God's love, right? I mean, and you know, that's frankly horribly offensive, right, from my perspective. And I think one of the important ways to talk about that is that, you know, Judaism didn't begin and end with the Hebrew Bible, right? We have another 2,000 years worth of religious literature and conversation and discussion and relationship with text and interpretation. And the religion that we practice now is not the religion of the Hebrew Bible in a lot of ways. And you know, there's no animal sacrifices anymore, right? There's no, you know, there's a huge amount of evolution that's taken place. And I think some of the conversation, the relationship between the text of the New Testament, and I'm by no means an expert in this, and I don't really want to say too much, but But the responses that are in the New Testament to the ways in which the Hebrew Bible talks about God are the same responses that that much of rabbinic literature from that era and succeeding centuries also had. So in other words, that evolution took place in Christianity, and it also took place in the beginning of Christianity, and it was also taking place simultaneously in the development of Judaism in that same era. So some of the same questions about, why did God do this or why did God do that were the same conversations that were being had by the rabbis, and similar responses actually. So I don't, not in a specific example is not coming to mind, but I think that's just important. I think a lot of times when in Christian communities, when they talk about Jews and they talk about the Hebrew Bible, it's like they're one and the same, and they're really not one and the same. Judaism is not, it's not the same. So I think that's just important to keep in mind in that conversation, among the zillions of larger picture answers I could give to Tracy's question, but that's one that was specific to the conversation that we're already having. So
could I speak to that briefly as well? Tracy?
Sure, please, yeah.
That's interesting. Rabbi Tamar makes an important point in that there is a long rabbinic Jewish tradition after the Hebrew Bible, a scriptural tradition. By the way, with a lot of debate in it. One of the things I love about that tradition, it's often said, various versions of the saying, 2 rabbis or 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? It's just a wonderfully dialectic, exploring kind of approach it takes. Martin Luther, in one of his very few actual dialogues with actual Jews, was very offended when they started quoting out of the Talmudic literature, the post-biblical Jewish literature. He regarded that as cheating. That's not scripture. And of course, that's a narrow-minded view for interfaith dialogue, certainly. From a modern perspective, it's worth noting that a lot of what Christians have come to appreciate about the New Testament has come through exploration of the rabbinic literature and its relevance for understanding the New Testament. Without it, we can't understand the New Testament anyways. Just one example I'll give briefly, and that's the saying that first occurs in Mark, the Sabbath was made for humans and not humans for the Sabbath. That saying occurs as well in rabbinic literature. It's a fundamental Jewish notion, and Jesus was articulating that as a Jew, when in Mark, Jesus is subsequently said to have said, therefore the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Traditional supersessionism in Christianity interprets that as saying, therefore I overrule Jewish views of the Sabbath. I, the Christian Jesus, overrule Jewish discussion of the Sabbath. That's not what's going on in Mark. And this is controversial, but it's a focus of some of my upcoming publication. When Jesus says, therefore the Son of Man, the human one, is the Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying the same things that the same thing that the rabbis said. That is that it should be up to the individual Jew to some significant extent to interpret in faith what the Sabbath means for them. Now, if you interpret the Son of Man, the human one, as solely a title for Jesus, that might not work. But modern scholarship has showed that that's a questionable assumption.
Thank you so much. We could go in so many different directions. This could be a whole series. And so thank you guys for your comments. And I apologize that we didn't get to all the questions, but I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Bird and go from there.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you to our panelists, Rabbi Tamar and Dr. Kirk Queller, for an enlightening and at times provocative examination of this important topic. And before we wrap up, I wanted to just thank our audience for your patience and your participation. We had 51 people registered, 46 at the peak, and 41 of you have stuck with us for the past hour and 10 minutes. As I mentioned at the beginning, the program will be recorded, and I do have a record of email addresses of everyone who registered, and I can share the link to that recording once it's available. We would also like to hear your suggestions of topics for future programs like this. I think there's considerable talent in our community of Pullman Moscow, as well as Spokane and Coeur d'Alene, that could be brought to bear, and perhaps with the help of our friends at FAVS, we might be able to publicize those to the larger faith community in the region. So in particular, I think we could explore a little bit of questions of how faith influences U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, and maybe bring in some diplomatic or political experts to assist with that. I'd like to thank our sponsors here in Moscow, the Lutheran Campus Ministry, Emanu-El Lutheran Church, and my friends at St. Mark's Episcopal Church for making this possible. And before we let our panelists and moderator go, I would invite any of you that have not turned on your cameras to do so, and to give a virtual round of applause with your hands, or just simply put up the hand in Zoom to show our appreciation. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today. Hope to see many of you again soon, either in person or on Zoom. And again, thanks to our moderator,